The wind screamed like something alive, and a man crawled into its teeth on hands that had stopped bleeding only because they'd gone numb. 8 feet of snow had swallowed the mountain whole. Somewhere beneath that white silence, an 8-year-old boy lay breathing in the dark, alive for one reason only: a hole in the rock. A cave an entire town had laughed at. They'd called it a grave, a den for bears, a cruel joke handed to a grieving father who had lost everything but the child clinging to his coat. Now the boy's father dug at the frozen vent with fingers he could no longer feel, because if the mountain stopped breathing, so would his son. No one was coming. No one had ever meant to. The people who cast him out were warm in their valley homes that night, certain the cold would finish what their cruelty had started. They were wrong about the cave, and they were wrong about the man. Before this winter loosened its grip, the very hands they had mocked would become the only thing standing between their own families and the storm. But that reckoning was still days away. First, there was the ice, the wind, and one stubborn promise. The trail ended where the soft ground gave way to stone. A man stood at that ragged edge of the world, one hand wrapped tight around the small hand of his son. In front of them, the mountain opened its mouth. A wound of black rock carved deep into the hillside, dark enough that the morning light seemed to stop at its edge and refuse to go further. Behind them, the wagon waited, and in that wagon sat a man whose face was harder than the frost on the grass. Silas Hartley did not look at the wagon. He looked at the cave. He had learned by then that the things behind a man could not be changed, and only the things ahead of him still could. "This is as far as the wagon goes," Harlan Shaw said. His voice carried the flat coldness of a man who had rehearsed cruelty until it no longer sounded like cruelty at all. "The cabin in the valley is mine now. The good pasture, the fences, the well, all mine. But this stretch of broken hillside, this stone, and that hole in the rock behind you." He let the words hang in the wind. "That was your wife's share. Came down to her from her people. So I'm giving it back. Fair is fair." It was not fair. It was a sentence dressed up as a gift. A strip of land where nothing grew, a slab of black rock, a cave that grown men used only to wait out a passing rain before hurrying home to real walls and real fires. Silas looked at the dark opening, then back at the man in the wagon. "You're sending a child up here," he said quietly, "to die before the first heavy snow even falls." There was no anger in his voice. The anger had burned out of him long ago, somewhere in the long nights of the winter before. What remained was something quieter, something heavier, a tiredness that lived in the bones. But the lack of anger only seemed to feed the older man's rage. "The one who sent people to die," Harlan said, his voice cracking open like ice over a river, "was you." The reins shook in his fists. "You let my sister freeze in that rotten timber shack you called a home. You watched the cold crawl into her chest, and you couldn't keep it out. So don't you stand there talking to me about children and dying." Beside Harlan, on the wagon bench, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed carefully on the horses. Della Shaw, She did not speak. She did not turn her head. But her knuckles had gone white, and her jaw was set in the way of a person holding something back with all their strength. Silas saw it. He said nothing of it. Harlan snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward, the wagon wheels grinding against the frozen ruts, and the whole thing turned back toward the valley below. Not once did the older man look behind him. The boy did. Asa Hartley watched the wagon until it shrank into the gray distance, his face pressed against his father's coat, both fists buried deep in the rough wool. He was 8 years old enough to understand that something had been taken from them, too young to understand why. "Pa," he whispered, his voice trembling against the wind. "We really going to live here?" Silas did not answer right away. He did not watch the wagon disappear. He had stopped watching the things that left him. Instead, he watched the wind. A thin thread of cold air slid across the mouth of the cave, and then it did something strange. Instead of curling back out the way it came, it bent sideways along the eastern wall, slipped into a narrow seam in the stone, and vanished into the dark. The mountain, it seemed, was breathing. Silas filed that small thing away in the quiet part of his mind, the way a careful man saves a single dry match in a wet world. He did not answer his son. Not yet. Some answers had to be earned before they could be spoken. The hatred in Harlan Shaw had not come from nowhere. It had been built, plank by plank, in the worst winter the valley had ever known. And to understand the cold, in the older man's eyes, you would have to go back to the small timber cabin at the edge of the Shaw land, and to the woman who had died there. Her name had been Lenora. She had married Silas against the wishes of her family, who thought a man with 2 strong hands and no land was no kind of match for a Shaw. She had laughed at their warnings. She had a way of laughing that made hard things seem small. Silas had built that cabin with those 2 strong hands. He had cut the timber himself, raised the walls himself, set every nail by lamplight after the long days of working other men's fields. He had been proud of it once. He had carried her over the threshold and told her it would keep her warm for 50 winters. He had been wrong. A man can outwork almost anything in this life, but he cannot outbuild a mountain that does not want him there. The smoke gathered under the low ceiling and would not leave. The wind found every gap between the planks, no matter how he packed them with clay and moss. The blankets never fully dried. The fire always burned. And yet, the warmth never seemed to stay once the flames settled low. Lenora began to cough in the deep part of the nights. At first it was nothing, a tickle, a clearing of the throat. Then it was something. Frost would creep across the floorboards beside the bed while she shivered beneath 2 quilts, and the cold seemed to rise up out of the very ground, climbing the walls, settling into her lungs like a guest that would not leave. Silas fed the fire until his hands cracked from the work of it. He sat beside her through the longest nights, holding her hand, watching the flames, waiting for the warmth that never came far enough into the room. One night, near the very end, she looked at him with eyes gone soft and far away, and she said something so quietly it almost sounded like an apology. "This house stays cold from the floor upward." Those were among the last clear words she ever spoke to him. Not goodbye, Not a blessing, just a small, true observation about the home he had built her. He would remember those words longer than he remembered the sound of the bell that rang at her funeral. The valley did not blame the mountain. The valley blamed the man. After Lenora was buried in the cold ground, the people of the small settlement stopped looking at Silas the way you look at a grieving widower. They began looking at him the way you look at a man who has failed at the one thing a man is supposed to do: keep his family warm, keep them safe, keep them alive. The whispers started at the blacksmith's. They drifted to the general store. They hardened, slowly, from pity into something colder and quieter than pity. And the Shaw family had enough weight in that valley to tip the scales of every opinion. Where Harlan led, the others followed, the way sheep follow a fence line without ever asking who built the fence. By the time the older man finally drove Silas off the ranch, most of the valley had already turned its back. They had simply done it politely, in the small ways that hurt the most. A nod that did not come. A conversation that stopped when he walked in. But here is the hardest truth of all. Silas Hartley had never forgiven himself either. On the worst nights, he still saw her face, still felt her cold hand in his, still heard the fire crackling bright and useless while the warmth stayed trapped near the ceiling, far from where she lay. That was why he never begged Harlan to let him stay. That was why he never went to the townspeople for help after they cast him out. He had lost his faith in thin wooden walls, and he had lost a little of his faith in people too. But faith in his son, that he would not lose. If the winter had already taken his wife inside a house with 4 walls and a roof and a roaring fire, then he was not about to let it take his boy the same way. He turned away from the past, the way a man turns away from a grave he has visited too many times. And he carried the torch into the dark. The cave swallowed the light slowly. Silas went first, the flame held high, and Asa stayed close behind him with one small hand fisted in the back of his father's coat. The old brown dog padded after them, low and silent, his nose lifted to read the air. Bracken had been Lenora's dog before he was anyone's. He had grieved her in his own quiet way, sleeping by the door of the timber cabin for weeks after she was gone, waiting for a step that never came. Now he moved through the dark cave, like he was reading a story written in scents that no man could see. The light pushed deeper. And then the strangest thing happened. The darkness grew thicker, but the cold did not. That was the first thing Silas noticed, and it stopped him in his tracks. Outside, the wind had cut through wool and skin alike, sharp enough to make a man's eyes water. But here, a dozen steps into the stone, the air had gone still, heavy, dry. It was the kind of stillness that does not belong to winter. Bracken circled once on the smooth basalt floor, then lay down on the bare stone without so much as a shiver. That, too, meant something. A dog will not lie on cold rock if there is anything warmer to be had. A dog knows the temperature of the world through the pads of his feet better than any man knows it through his mind. Silas crouched low and pressed his palm flat against the stone. Not warm, but not the biting cold of the world outside, either. Something in between, something steady, something that did not change just because the sun had gone behind the ridge. He lifted the torch a little higher, and the flame leaned. It leaned toward that same narrow seam in the eastern wall, the one the wind had slipped into outside. The smoke from the torch did not roll back into his face the way it should have in a sealed room. It drifted sideways, found the crack, and was pulled gently away into the deeper dark. The mountain was moving air through the stone. Somewhere beneath them, in passages no eye would ever see, the rock breathed in and breathed out, slow and patient, the way it had for longer than any man had been alive to notice. Silas stayed crouched there a long time, his hand on the stone, his eyes on the leaning flame. Behind him, his son had gone quiet. He turned. Asa had slid down against the wall, his thin shoulders curled in, his chin dropped to his chest. The boy had not meant to sleep, but the long cold day, the fear, the grinding wheels of the wagon carrying away the last of the only family they had left, it had emptied him out. And the cave, in its strange, dry stillness, had filled the empty space with rest. 10 minutes. That was all it took. 10 minutes. And the boy was asleep. Silas knelt beside him and watched the small chest rise and fall, the breath coming smooth and even, no coughing, no shivering. He could not remember the last time he had watched his son sleep without listening, in the back of his mind, for the catch of breath, the rattle in the chest, the sound that had haunted the last weeks of Lenora's life. Here, in a hole in the rock that the whole valley had laughed at, the boy simply slept. And in that moment, a thought entered Silas Hartley's mind. A strange thought, a dangerous one, the kind of thought that can take hold of a man and change the entire shape of his life if he lets it. Stone might hold what timber never could, warmth. The thought frightened him more than the cold did, because to believe it was to hope again. And he had learned, in the hardest school there is, exactly what it cost a man to hope and then to fail. He had hoped he could keep Lenora warm. He could not bear to hope wrong a second time, not with his son's life as the price. He did not sleep that first night. He sat with his back against the basalt wall, the torch burned down to a glowing stub, the boy curled against his side, and the old dog stretched out at his feet. And he listened, not for danger, for the breathing of the mountain. He could just barely hear it if he held himself perfectly still, a faint, low drawing of air through the stone, like the slow breath of something vast and asleep. It rose, it fell, it did not stop. And somewhere in the long hours before dawn, Silas Hartley made a decision. He would not run from this place. He would not go down into the valley with his hat in his hands and beg the people who had turned their backs to take him in. He would not trust his son's life to thin wooden walls a second time. He would learn this mountain. He would learn the way the air moved through it, the way the stone held its heat, the way the cold tried to climb up out of the ground at night. He would learn all of it, the way Lenora had learned to laugh at hard things, the way that made the impossible seem small. And he would build, inside this stone, the one thing he had failed to give her, a place that stayed warm from the floor upward. When the gray light finally crept across the mouth of the cave, Asa stirred. The boy sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, and for a moment a flash of fear crossed his small face as he remembered where he was. His gaze went to the dark opening, to the world of white cold waiting beyond it. Then he frowned. "Pa," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Why ain't I cold?" Silas looked at his son for a long moment. Then, for the first time since Lenora had been laid in the ground, something moved at the corner of his mouth that was almost a smile. "Because the mountain," he said quietly, "is keeping a secret." "What secret?" "That it knows how to hold the warm in." He rested one rough hand on the boy's hair. "And we're going to learn it." Asa thought about that. He was a serious child, the way children become serious when they have watched their mother die and their family turn cold. He did not laugh or clap or ask the easy questions of an easier boyhood. He just nodded slowly, like a small man taking on a large promise. "Okay, Pa," he said. And that was all. Down in the valley that morning, Harlan Shaw stood at the window of the cabin that had once been Silas Hartley's home, and he looked up toward the dark stretch of hillside in the high country. He could not see the cave from there. It was too far, too high, hidden in the folds of the mountain. But he knew it was there. His wife came and stood beside him. Della Shaw had not slept well. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there before the wagon ride. "You think the boy's all right up there?" she asked softly. Harlan did not answer for a long while. "That's not our concern anymore," he said at last. But his voice did not have the iron in it that it had carried the day before. Della looked at the side of her husband's face. She had known him her whole married life, known the good in him that he buried deeper every year, known the grief over his sister that he had turned into stone because stone was easier to carry than tears. "Lenora loved that man," she said quietly. "Whatever else is true, she loved him." "Lenora's dead," Harlan said, and he walked away from the window. But that night, and the night after, he would find himself drawn back to it, looking up toward the high dark country where a single thread of smoke had begun to rise, thin and steady, from a place that was supposed to hold nothing but a frightened man and a dying boy. The smoke did not waver. It climbed straight and sure into the cold sky, the way smoke climbs only when the fire beneath it is tended by someone who has not given up. Harlan watched it longer than he meant to, and he said nothing to anyone about the strange, uneasy feeling it stirred in him. The feeling that perhaps he had not driven a broken man up to die on a barren rock at all. The feeling that he had instead set something in motion he did not understand and could not call back. Up in the cave, Silas hung a single piece of cloth near the place where his son slept. It was an old gray wool sweater, Lenora's, the last thing of hers he had kept, carried up the mountain wrapped around a tin of matches, as if the matches were the precious thing. He hung it on a wooden peg, driven into the stone, close to where the air stayed warmest. He did not explain why. Asa did not ask. Some things between a father and a son do not need words. The boy understood. In the wordless way children understand the grief of the people they love, that the sweater was a way of keeping his mother near, that she would have wanted to be warm, and that, for the first time in a very long time, someone in this family finally was. Silas added a small piece of wood to the fire, not a roaring blaze. He had learned the lesson of the roaring blaze in a cold cabin a winter ago. A roaring fire is a frightened man's fire, burning fuel to fight a cold it cannot beat. This was something else. This was a small, patient, careful flame, set against stone that would drink its heat and hold it, and give it back slowly through the long hours of the dark. He watched the boy sleep. He watched the dog sleep. He watched the gray sweater move just slightly. In the gentle current of air the mountain pulled through its hidden veins. And somewhere in the deepest part of him, beneath the grief and the guilt and the long exhaustion, a single ember of something he had thought was dead began, very quietly, to glow again. Not happiness. It was too soon for that. Something smaller, something harder, something that would have to carry them through the dark months ahead. Hope, the kind of hope that does not announce itself, the kind that simply sets one more piece of wood on the fire and decides to live until morning. Outside, the first real snow of the season began to fall. It came down soft and silent over the high country, settling on the black rock, on the bare trees, on the long trail that led down to a valley full of people who were certain they had seen the last of Silas Hartley. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about so many things. But that is a story for the cold months still to come. For now, there was only this: a father, a son, an old dog, and a fire burning low and patient in the heart of a mountain that had decided, for reasons of its own, to keep them. And as the snow thickened beyond the cave mouth, Silas Hartley pulled his sleeping son a little closer, rested his head back against the warm stone, and closed his eyes at last. The mountain breathed. The fire held, and for the first time since the worst winter of his life had taken everything from him. The man let himself believe that this winter might give something back. A man can learn many things on his own, but some things must be learned from someone who has already paid the price for knowing them. Silas Hartley understood this, and so, in the gray hush of an early morning, with the first thin snow still clinging to the rocks like something afraid to fall, he left his son wrapped warm beside the low fire, told the old dog to stay and watch over him, and went out into the cold to find the one man in all the high country who was said to understand the mountain better than the mountain understood itself. They called him Amos Thorne, a trapper, a hermit, a man who had walked away from the company of people so long ago that most folks down in the valley spoke of him the way they spoke of weather. Something out there, something old, something you did not argue with, and did not go looking for unless you had run out of every other choice. Silas had run out of every other choice. The trail to the old man's place was barely a trail at all. It wound up through bare gray trees and across a frozen spring, climbing higher into country where the wind had teeth and the silence pressed against a man's ears. More than once, Silas lost the path entirely and had to find it again by instinct, by the lean of the land, by the way the snow lay thinner where boots had once worn the earth down. At last he came to a low shelter built half into the hillside itself. It was the kind of place you could walk right past and never know a soul lived there. Smoke rose thin from a crack in the rock above it. A few traps hung frozen on a line, and out front, swinging an axe with the slow, even rhythm of a man who has all the time in the world and none to waste, stood Amos Thorne. He looked nearly as weathered as the stone behind him, a long gray beard, stiff with frost at the edges. One shoulder set lower than the other, from some old hurt he had never explained to a living person, and eyes that studied a man the way a careful traveler studies the ice on a river crossing, hunting for the thin place that will open up and swallow him whole. He did not greet Silas. He simply kept swinging the axe, one slow stroke after another, until the younger man came to a stop a few feet away, and the quiet between them stretched long and thin. Then, without lifting his eyes from the wood, the old man spoke. "You'd be the one they sent up to the breathing cave." Silas blinked. "The breathing cave?" The axe came down. The wood split clean, falling away in two pale halves. "The mountain pulls air through it," Amos said. "Always has. In through the low seams, out through the high ones." He set another log on the stump. "Or in through the high and out through the low when the wind decides to turn. Depends on her mood that day." "Her mood," Silas repeated. "The mountain." Now the old man looked up, and his eyes were sharp and cold, and not unkind. "She's got moods, same as anything alive. A man who forgets that." He let the axe rest against the stump. "A man who forgets that ends up cold. Or worse than cold." Silas told him then what he had seen. The way the air stayed dry and still inside the stone, when the world outside cut a man to the bone. The way the smoke leaned toward the eastern seam instead of rolling back. The way his son had slept warm on bare rock when by every law Silas knew the boy should have been shivering. Amos listened without a word. He let the younger man say all of it. He did not nod, did not interrupt, did not so much as shift his weight. He simply listened, the way the deep woods listen, taking everything in and giving nothing back. And when Silas had finished, the old man wiped his hands slowly on his coat, and he said the most important thing anyone would say to Silas Hartley that whole, long, bitter winter. "Basalt holds heat, the way timber never will." He said it plainly, no drama in it. The way a man states a thing he has known so long it has worn smooth, like a river stone, every sharp edge rubbed away by time. The deep ground stays near the same all year round. Winter only ever bites the surface of the world. So if a man builds it right, a cave like yours can keep him warm clear through to spring, without burning down half a forest to do it. He paused. But the heat ain't your trouble, son. The air is, always the air. He bent and picked up a length of burned pine from beside the woodpile, and he turned it slow in the gray light, studying it as though it might still have something left to say. A cabin leaks heat, bleeds it out through every crack and every gap, no matter how hard you pack the walls. His voice softened, just slightly, and for a moment something old and painful moved behind his eyes. That's why a cabin can't hold the warmth through a real winter. You can feed it wood all night and still wake up to frost on the inside of the door. Silas thought of a timber cabin at the edge of the Shaw land. He thought of frost spreading across the floorboards beside a bed. He said nothing. But a cave, Amos went on. A cave holds everything. That's the gift of it and the curse of it both. It'll hold the warmth for you, sure enough. But it'll hold the smoke just as faithful. He set the burned pine down. You build it tight, and you feed the fire wrong, and that mountain will keep the poison right there in the dark with you and the boy, and it won't let either one out till morning. The words went into Silas like cold water down the back of the neck. How do I keep that from happening? And here is where the old man did the thing that surprised him. He did not offer to come. He did not reach for his coat or pack his tools or sketch a single line in the frozen dirt. He did not follow Silas back up the ridge to set his own 2 weathered hands to the work. He only looked at the younger man for a long, measuring moment, and then he said, "Can't tell you. Not really. You just did. I told you what's true." Amos shook his head slowly. "But knowing what's true and feeling it in your 2 hands are 2 different mountains, son. You'll build it wrong before you build it right. You'll learn the why of it by living through the wrong. That's the only teacher worth a thing up here, and there ain't a word I can give you that'll do the job instead." He turned back to his woodpile. "The mountain don't care what I know," he said, lifting the axe again. "She only cares what you learn. And she's a patient teacher. But she don't grade easy." And that was all. Silas stood a moment longer, waiting for more. Some part of him had walked all that cold way, hoping for a map, a method, a set of plain instructions he could carry home in his pocket like seed. More did not come. The axe rose and fell. The wood split clean. So Silas turned and he started back down the barely there trail, carrying nothing but a handful of plain words and the full and crushing weight of a task that now belonged entirely and only to him. Somewhere on that long walk down, the fear in him slowly hardened into something else. Not confidence. He was not fool enough for that. But resolve. The kind a man finds when there is no one left to lean on, and the only way forward runs straight through his own 2 hands. For 6 days, Silas Hartley worked from the first gray light of dawn until the mountain disappeared into the dark. He cut lodgepole pine along the lower ridge, and he dragged the trunks up the slope one at a time, a rope harness biting deep into his shoulders, his boots slipping on the frozen ground. Each trunk took the better part of an hour. By the 3rd day, his shoulders were raw beneath his coat, and the rope had worn the wool clean through. He did not stop. There is a kind of work a man does when his own comfort is at stake, and there is another kind entirely when it is the life of his child. The second kind does not know how to quit. It simply goes on, past tiredness, past pain, past the point where the body begs to lie down in the snow and rest. And he was not alone in the work. Asa carried moss and wet clay up from the half-frozen creek, hauling it in a battered tin pail, his small face set with the very same stubborn seriousness his father wore. He fell once on the icy bank and soaked his sleeve to the elbow in the cold water, and he did not cry. He simply got up, refilled the pail, and kept climbing. "You don't have to do all this," Silas told him once, watching the boy struggle up the slope. Asa looked at him like the words made no sense. "Yes, I do," he said. "It's our house." And he kept climbing. Even the old dog worked. Bracken dragged the smaller branches behind him, a loop of rope tied loose around his chest, his breath fogging in the bitter air, his old joints stiff with the cold. He hauled his share up the slope without being asked twice, and when he reached the top, he would drop the branch by the woodpile and turn straight back down for another, as though he, too, understood that the winter was coming and the work could not wait. Slowly, the mouth of the cave began to change. First came the trench, cut along the eastern edge of the entrance, to carry the meltwater away before it could pool and freeze across the floor. Then came the wall. Silas built it across the throat of the cave, a double layer of timber chinked with the clay his son had carried up, narrow enough to trap the warmth behind it, with a gap left open at the very top, wide enough, he hoped, to let the smoke climb up and away. Then he set flat slabs of shale above the fire pit, angling them with care, so that the rising heat would be caught and pushed back down, deeper into the chamber, instead of escaping straight up and out the way fire always wants to go. It was slow work, patient work, the work of a man building not a place to hide for a single hard night, but a place to remain. On the 7th night, he lit the first real fire, and for a few minutes, it was beautiful. The flame caught and steadied. The heat rolled off the angled shale and spread low and even through the chamber. Asa lay on the stone bench, his eyes heavy, the warmth wrapping around his small body like a mother's arm. Bracken stretched out and sighed in his sleep. The gray sweater hung still and warm upon its peg, and Silas felt something rise in his chest that he had not let himself feel in a very long time. Pride. He had done it. He had built the thing the whole valley swore could not be built. The wind shifted outside. It happened in a single heartbeat. One moment the smoke climbed clean and true up the throat of the cave. The next, a gust slammed against the mountain from the wrong direction, and the draft reversed. The smoke turned back on them. Black and thick and stinging, it rolled backward through the gap in the throat wall and poured down into the chamber so fast that Asa woke choking, his small body curling forward, coughing in great racking heaves that tore at his father's heart far worse than any cold ever could. Bracken scrambled up barking and backed away from the darkening air. Silas moved before he could think. He smothered the fire with handful after handful of dirt, faster than he had ever moved in his life, his own eyes streaming, burning so badly he could scarcely see the walls of the place he had built with such pride only minutes before. The chamber filled with the gray sting of dead smoke, and the cold. The cold came rushing back into the stone almost the instant the fire died. He carried Asa to the mouth of the cave, into the clean, bitter air, and held him there while the boy coughed and gasped and slowly found his breath again. The night was black and freezing around them. The dog pressed close against the boy's legs, whining low. For a long time afterward, Silas sat in the dark with his arm around his son, feeling the last of the warmth bleed out of the walls, feeling the night creep back in through the stone. And a thought came to him then, an ugly thought, the kind that waits in the dark for a tired and frightened man and slips in when his guard is down. What if Harlan was right? What if a cave really was a grave, after all, and he had only fooled himself into believing otherwise out of pride and grief and a desperate refusal to beg? What if his own stubborn pride was about to cost him the one and only person he had left in all the world? Asa coughed again, softly, in his sleep, and Silas Hartley pressed his lips to the top of his son's head and made himself a quiet and terrible promise. He would learn this, or he would die in the learning of it. But he would not let it take the boy. Not the way it had taken the boy's mother. Not while there was breath in his body and strength in his hands. He did not run back down the mountain to beg Amos Thorne for the answer. He remembered what the old man had said. You'll learn the why of it by living through the wrong. So instead of asking, he watched. For the better part of the next day, Silas Hartley did almost nothing at all but study the place he had made. He lit small, careful test flames, no bigger than a candle, and he knelt beside them for hours, watching where the smoke chose to go. He pressed his bare palm against a dozen different sections of wall and felt for the places where the cold leaked in. He noticed where the stone wept with damp, and where it stayed dry as old bone. And slowly, the real trouble showed itself to him. The cave was not failing to make heat. It was bleeding the heat away faster than it could ever hold it. The damp was the thief. Moisture rose up out of the ground and out of the stone itself, and it carried the warmth off with it as surely as a hole in the roof of a house. A man could build the finest fire in the world, and the rising damp would steal it before the stone could ever drink it in. And the smoke had backed up, not because the throat wall was built wrong, but because the draft had nowhere clean to climb when the wind turned. The mountain breathed in two directions, and he had built for only one. So he went back to the work. He widened the drainage trench until it pulled the meltwater clear away from the chamber. He hauled coarse gravel up from the creek and spread it thick across part of the floor, so the damp would sink down through it instead of rising up into the room. He fitted a second lining of shale behind the throat wall, and he lowered the ceiling above the sleeping bench with cedar poles and stretched hides, building a kind of pocket where the warm air would gather close and stay near the boy through the night. Then he cut a second vent, a narrower one, carved with the stone pick through the softer shale, set so that when the wind turned and shoved against the main shaft, the draft would still have somewhere honest to go, and the smoke would never again come hunting through the dark for his son's lungs. That night, he lit a smaller fire, a patient fire, the kind he was only beginning to understand. And he sat beside it, and he waited, and he watched. His whole body tensed for the moment the smoke would turn. It did not turn. It climbed, clean and steady. It found the high seam and the new bypass both, and it rose up and out into the cold sky, and it left the air in the chamber dry and still and slowly, steadily warm. By midnight, the stone behind the bench held heat enough to make the whole chamber glow with a comfort that seemed almost impossible in such a place. And when Silas reached out to feel the small pair of socks he had set to dry near the warm rock, they were dry. He held them in his cracked and bleeding hands, two small dry socks, and for a moment he could not speak, could not move, could only kneel there in the firelight, while something in his chest came loose that had been clenched tight for over a year. For the first time in this cold stone place that the whole world had laughed at, a small thing had simply worked exactly the way it was meant to. He hung Lenora's gray sweater on its peg beside the bench, where the warmth would reach it and keep it forever from going stiff with frost. He did not say anything to it, but he let his hand rest against the soft, worn wool a moment in the firelight, the way a man rests his hand on the shoulder of someone he has loved and lost. "It holds the warm now," he said very quietly, from the floor up. And then he lay down beside his sleeping son, in the warmth he had finally, at such a cost, learned how to keep, and he slept the whole night through. The valley below did not want him to succeed. He felt it every single time he came down off the ridge to trade for the few things the mountain could not give him: lamp oil, salt, the small necessities that stand between a person and the long dark of winter. The store was kept by a widow named Mabel Cruz. She held the books for half the valley's winter credit, which meant she held a kind of quiet power that no one ever named out loud, and yet everyone obeyed. A word from Mabel Cruz could open a man's account or close it like a slammed door. And she had decided, somewhere along the way, exactly what she thought of the man living up in the cave. "A hole in the rock is fine for a bear come snow season," she said one afternoon, loud enough for the whole store to hear, her pen scratching figures into the ledger without pause. "Never in all my years heard of one fit for raising a child." Nobody laughed. That was the worst of it. A laugh Silas could have borne. A laugh is thrown out into the open air, where a man can turn and face it. But this was something quieter than a laugh. A spoon that stopped halfway to a mouth near the stove. A pair of boots that shifted against the floorboards. Eyes that followed him across the room and slid away before they could be caught and held. Silas said nothing. He bought what little he could afford, which grew smaller every week, because the prices had a strange and quiet way of climbing the moment his shadow fell across the threshold. The lamp oil cost near double what it had a fortnight before. The salt came in a smaller sack, and the good whale oil seemed to vanish clean off the shelves whenever he walked in, only to reappear, folks said, the moment he was gone. He never argued. He never once defended himself. He simply found other ways to pay for what his son needed. One morning he repaired a broken wagon axle behind the blacksmith's shed in exchange for a sack of meal. The next, he spent half a day patching cracked harness leather for a cattle hauler trying to get his herd east before the high passes closed for good. After that came wood splitting and fence mending and the hauling of iron. Anything at all that would trade the strength of his two hands for the things that kept a boy alive. The work tore his hands open, the old calluses split, and the new blisters broke, and the cold got into the raw places until every swing of the axe was a small, bright agony. And still he kept the axe swinging, long after the sun had dropped behind the western ridge and the other men had gone home to their fires. Pastor Brandt saw him one evening, working alone in the freezing dark outside the forge. The pastor was a quiet man, not given to the loud and easy certainties of some who wear the collar. He stood in the shadows a while and watched the man swing the axe with blood shining black on his palms in the last light, and he did not step forward to offer charity. He understood, better than most, that there are men who cannot take charity and still keep their souls whole, and that to offer it would be a kind of cruelty dressed up as kindness. But he remembered it. He remembered the sight of a father bleeding in the cold dark to keep his child warm, and it troubled him in ways he could not yet put a name to. Up at the cave, Asa never once complained. The boy had a pair of boots with a sole worn nearly through, and on the coldest days the wet crept into them and chilled his feet clear to the bone. He knew his father had no coin to spare for new ones, so he pushed the worn boots deep under the blankets when Silas was away at his work, and he never breathed a single word about it. A child should not have to learn that kind of silence, but this one had. There was a young ranch hand named Wade Reed who came up the ridge one afternoon, carrying a burlap sack of dried venison over one shoulder, drawn more by curiosity than by any particular kindness. He stopped talking the moment he stepped inside. Most men expected a cave to feel colder once they got back away from the daylight. This one did not. The air was still and dry and warm in a way that made no earthly sense to a man who had spent his whole life fighting the winter with timber walls and roaring iron stoves. Silas saw him staring at the stone bench. "Go ahead," he said. Wade pressed one bare hand against the dark rock. His eyebrows lifted before he could school his face into stillness. The bench had been soaking up the heat of small, careful fires for days on end. It was not hot. It was simply, impossibly warm. Warm enough to keep the cold from ever settling into the floor once the sun went down. "That ain't possible," Wade muttered under his breath. Silas did not answer him. He had stopped trying to explain it with words. The cave did its own explaining, plain and silent, to anyone willing to lay a hand on the stone and feel the truth for themselves. For the better part of an hour, the young man walked the chamber, asking short, sharp questions about the airflow and the gravel bed and the angle of the shale above the fire. There was a real hunger in him to understand it. Silas could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, could see a young mind catching fire with the wonder of a thing it had been taught was impossible. When Wade left that day, something in him had changed. But he did not come back the next week, nor the week after that. And Silas understood exactly why the morning he saw the Shaw feed wagons rolling south along the valley road, loaded heavy, bound for the ranches that owed Harlan Shaw their winter credit. In a hard country, in a hard season, a man's loyalties are bought and paid for long before the truth ever gets the chance to open its mouth. That night, Asa sat beside the fading fire and asked in his small and careful voice, "Wade hate us now, Pa?" Silas stared into the red coals a long moment before he answered. "No," he said quietly. "Winter just makes people afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Of needing things." He stirred the embers with a stick. "And afraid of the folks who might just remember they turned their backs, once the needing's all over and done." Asa thought about that, the way he thought about everything now, slow and serious and far older than his years. "We won't turn our backs," he said at last. "Not even on Wade. Not even if he hates us." Silas looked at his son in the soft red firelight. "No," he said. "No, we won't." And something in his chest ached, fierce and sweet, at the plain goodness of the boy. The goodness that the cold and the cruelty and the long grief had somehow failed to kill. The same goodness that had lived once in the boy's mother. As the weeks deepened, the cave slowly stopped feeling like a place where two desperate people were hiding from the world. It began to feel like a place that had been built to last. Silas finished the long stone bench, stacking river rocks behind it so the rock could drink the heat all through the evening and give it back, slow and faithful, through the deep cold of the night. Long after the fire had burned down to gray ash, he raised a sleeping shelf of cedar poles lashed high into the wall, above the coldest layer of ground air that pooled along the floor in the dead hours. He stretched a drying line between two iron spikes hammered into the basalt. And for the first time since the bad winter, wet clothes dried clean overnight instead of freezing stiff as boards before the dawn. And Asa learned the mountain the way other children learn their letters. He learned to lie still in the dark and listen to the air move through the vent, and to know by the sound of it alone whether the draft was running strong or growing dangerously weak. He learned which stones held their heat the longest after the fire died. He learned that a strong draft sang low and steady through the rock, and a failing one whistled high and thin, like a warning. The boy was becoming something rare, a reader of the mountain. And the old dog understood it best of them all. Whenever the weather was about to turn, Bracken would rise from his warm place beside the bench and pad over to the eastern vent, and there he would stand, nose lifted, ears working, listening to something in the deep air that no human soul could hear. Silas learned to watch the dog the way sailors of old once watched the seabirds, reading the future in the small, certain movements of a creature wiser in such things than himself. One evening, as the last light failed, Della Shaw climbed partway up the ridge. She came alone. She did not come all the way to the cave. She stopped where the trail steepened and the footing turned treacherous, and she set down a small bundle wrapped in cloth, and she stood there a long while, looking up toward the thread of smoke that climbed straight and sure into the darkening sky. Then she turned and went back down the way she had come, without a single word. When Silas found the bundle later, he opened it carefully in the firelight. Inside was a pair of boy's boots, worn but sound, with good thick soles and barely any wear left in the leather. And tucked down into the toe of one, a small twist of paper holding a few hard candies, the kind a child counts as treasure. There was no note. There did not need to be one. Silas stood there in the cold with the boots in his rough hands, and he understood that down in that hard valley, behind the iron and the grief of her husband, there lived a woman who had not been able to make her peace with what had been done to a child. He gave the boots to Asa the next morning. "Where'd these come from, Pa?" Silas was quiet a moment. "From somebody," he said, "who's sorry, even if she can't yet find the way to say so out loud." Asa pulled them on. They fit him well. He wiggled his toes inside the dry, whole, well-made leather, and a smile spread across his face. A real one, the kind Silas had not seen on his son in a very long time. It was a small thing, but up there, in the high and bitter cold, the small things had become the whole of everything. Harlan Shaw came up the mountain in the second deep week of the snow. He came with a rifle slung across one shoulder and enough suspicion in him to fill the whole valley below twice over. He told himself he had come only to check on the boy. to see for himself that his dead sister's child was not lying frozen and forgotten in some hole in the rock, the way the careful whispers down in the settlement had begun to suggest. He told himself that, but there was something else driving him up that long, cold ridge, something he could not name and did not care to look at too closely. A pull, an unease. The memory of a thread of smoke that climbed too straight, too steady, too sure of itself to belong to a beaten and dying man. Silas let him in without a single word of argument. Harlan stopped just inside the throat wall, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. He looked at the firewood, stacked neat and dry beneath its canvas cover. He looked at the trench, cut clean and careful to carry the water away. He looked at the narrow vent disappearing up into the black stone, and the angled shale set above the fire, and the raised shelf where a boy could sleep up above the killing cold of the floor. He did not praise any of it, but he did not laugh either. And in a man like Harlan Shaw, the simple absence of mockery was very nearly a confession. Asa sat near the warm bench, eating a bowl of stew, and the old dog lay along the eastern wall with one ear cocked toward the stranger. Steam rose off the bowl and drifted upward, clean and untroubled, through air that did not choke or sting the eyes. Harlan watched as Silas lifted a small iron kettle from beside the fire. The water inside had a thin skin of ice across the top, left from the bitter cold of the night before. Now most men, faced with frozen water of a morning, would build the fire up higher, throw on more wood, drive the cold back with force and noise and the steady, careless waste of fuel that a hard winter could so ill afford. Silas did no such thing. He simply slid the kettle up against the heat-soaked river stones lining the back of the bench and waited. Within a few minutes, the ice softened. Then it cracked. Then it broke apart entirely into clear water. No roaring fire, no wasted wood, only the stored heat, given up slow and patient by the faithful stone, in just the same way the deep mountain gave up its warmth to those who learned to ask it gently. Harlan watched the whole thing happen. He watched it a good deal longer than he likely realized, because Harlan Shaw had spent the whole of his life judging a shelter by the size of its fire, by how much smoke rolled black from the chimney, by how hard and how loud a man could drive back the dark and the cold. And here, in a hole in the rock, was a man measuring something else entirely. Heat kept, fuel saved, air controlled, a whole different way of living through a winter, a way that did not fight the mountain at all, that did not waste its strength battering against the cold, but listened to it and worked with the rules the mountain had been keeping since long before any man was born to break them. At one point, Harlan stepped closer to the bench. He reached out one rough, weathered hand, almost without meaning to, and he rested it flat against the stone. It was warm, still warm, hours after the fire had burned down low. He pulled his hand back without a word, but something had moved in his face. Some small frozen thing had shifted, and just then Asa held up his empty bowl. "Can I have some more, Pa?" So Silas took the bowl and ladled out a little more of the stew and handed it back, and the boy fell to it with the deep and bottomless hunger of a child who is, at long last, truly and completely warm. Harlan looked at the boy, really looked at him for the first time since he had driven that wagon away, at the good color in his cheeks, at the dry, sound boots upon his feet, at the easy, untroubled way he ate, with no rattle deep in his chest, no shiver in his thin shoulders, no cough. The boy was thriving. In the cave that Harlan Shaw had handed over as nothing less than a death sentence. The only child of his dead sister was thriving, and something in the older man's face, some hard and frozen and long-locked thing that had not moved since the worst winter of his life, finally, just slightly, began to crack. He did not say it. Men like Harlan Shaw do not know the words for such things. But before he left that evening, he stood at the mouth of the cave a moment longer than he had any need to. He looked out at the snow gathering deep and silent on the high country, and then he looked back, once, at the warm red glow burning deep inside the stone. "You keep that boy fed," he said gruffly. It was not an apology. It was not even kindness, exactly, but it was the first thing Harlan Shaw had said to Silas Hartley in over a year that did not carry hatred coiled inside it like a snake. And as the older man started back down the dark trail toward the valley below, Silas stood at the mouth of the cave, watching him go, and he understood that something between the two of them had shifted. Quiet and unseen, like a draft turning deep inside a mountain, changing from that night onward. The whole way the air would move. Behind him, the fire held. The stone stayed warm, and the gray sweater hung beside the bench, swaying just slightly in the patient breath of the mountain, as if someone unseen had brushed gently past it on her way to look, one more time, and see that the child was warm, and that the man who had failed her once was at last learning how not to fail again. There are warnings that come in words. And there are warnings that come in the quiet of a man's eyes when he speaks of something he has buried for a very long time. Amos Thorne gave Silas Hartley the second kind. It happened on a still afternoon, gray and waiting, when the old trapper climbed partway up the ridge and stopped outside the cave without coming in. He had not visited before. He did not seem to want to start now. He simply stood near the outer wall, looking at the smoke, the way a man looks at a fire he is not sure he trusts. "It's holding," Silas told him. "The draft, the heat, all of it." The old man nodded slowly. "It's holding now," he said. "In fair weather, near anything holds." Then he was quiet a while, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register Silas had not heard from him before. Lower, rougher, carrying the weight of something dragged up from a deep place. "There was a boy once," Amos said, "my grandson, long while back, mine to keep, after his folks were gone." He did not look at Silas as he spoke. He looked out toward the far white country, at nothing at all. "I'd built us a place. Tight as a drum, I thought. Proud of it. Same as you were proud of yours that first night." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Held the heat like a blessing. Best shelter I ever made." The wind moved dry snow across the rocks with a sound like sand sliding over wood, but it held the smoke just as good as it held the heat. The old man's voice did not break. It had broken, perhaps, a long time ago, and set wrong, like a bone. Came a night the draft turned, and I never woke to feel it turn. The warm just lulled us both down into sleep. He paused. I woke. The boy didn't. Silas said nothing. There was nothing in the world to say. That's the thing they don't tell you about the smoke, Amos went on, quieter still. It don't come at a man like a fire, roaring, giving him a chance to run. It comes soft. It comes warm. It lays a man down gentle in the very comfort he built, and it doesn't let him up again. He turned at last and looked at Silas with those old, cold, grieving eyes. Your cave is good, better than good, but the better it holds the warm, the better it'll hold the death, if you ever let the draft go wrong on the worst night. And the worst night, son. The worst night always comes when a man's too tired to watch for it. That was all he said. He did not come inside. He did not check the throat wall, or test the vent, or offer to stay through whatever was coming. He had given the only thing he had to give, a wound, opened up and laid bare, so that another man's son might live. Then the old trapper turned and went back down the ridge, alone, into the gray and waiting afternoon. And the weight of what was coming settled once again entirely onto Silas Hartley's shoulders. The change began 3 days later. It did not announce itself with thunder or with any great darkening of the sky. It came the way the worst things often come, in a silence that was somehow louder than any noise. Silas felt it before he understood it. The wind, which had blown steady off the high ridges for weeks, simply stopped. Not calmed, stopped. As though the whole vast mountain had drawn a long breath and was holding it. He stepped out from the cave and stood looking at the world, and slowly he saw what the stillness was trying to tell him. There was no movement along the lower tree line, no deer drifting through the gray timber, the way there always were at that hour. The birds had gone quiet. Even the small, busy life of the high country, the things a man never notices until they are missing, had vanished. And the dog knew. Bracken stood at the mouth of the cave with his hackles raised and his nose pointed toward the eastern divide, and from somewhere deep in his old chest came a low, steady growl at nothing Silas could see. You feel it, too, Silas murmured. The dog did not look at him. He kept his eyes fixed on the far country, where the sky had taken on a strange and waiting color. By afternoon, a thin, dry snow began to drift down out of that color, not falling so much as sifting. It moved in pale gray streams along the ground, and it did not look like ordinary snow at all. It looked like ash blowing off some distant, hidden fire. Silas did not wait to learn what it meant. He had learned by then what it cost a man to wait. He threw himself into the work with a kind of grim and silent fury. He hauled more river stones up into the chamber, all he could carry, building up the mass of rock that would drink the heat and hold it through whatever was coming. He filled every bucket and kettle and basin with water from the creek before the cold could lock it under deeper ice. He braced the throat wall with a second timber beam, wedged hard against the stone. And then he did something he had never done before. He packed snow, deep and tight, against the whole outer face of the shelter, building a thick blanket of it around the exposed entrance where the wind would strike the hardest. A wall of white against the white that was coming. Asa watched him work, and the boy understood, in his quiet way, that this was different. His father moved faster now, spoke less, checked the airflow not every few hours, but every hour, his head cocked to the sound of the draft in the dark. "Pa," the boy asked once, "is it gonna be bad?" Silas paused, just for a moment, one hand against the cold stone. "Maybe," he said. He would not lie to the boy. He had never lied to the boy. "Maybe real bad, but we built her right, and we'll watch her close, you and me and Bracken, the three of us." Asa nodded, slow and serious. "The three of us," he repeated. Near sunset, Silas dragged 2 heavy support beams across the cave entrance and fastened them tight and diagonal against the outer wall. It was the first time the boy had ever seen his father reinforce the shelter, as though bracing for something strong enough to tear it apart. And out beyond the cave, the mountain stayed unnaturally still, like a man holding his breath, like something vast and old and patient, waiting to deliver a judgment it had decided upon long ago. The storm broke loose in the dead heart of the night. One moment, the mountain lay silent beneath the low and waiting sky. The next, the whole of the world simply disappeared. The snow did not fall. It attacked. The wind came screaming down off the high divide and drove the frozen powder sideways across the ridge, so hard and so fast that it no longer looked like falling snow at all. It looked alive, white streaks tearing through the black, clawing at the rock, hammering against the braced timber of the outer wall like something with a will and a fury all its own. The canyon beyond the cave vanished before the first gray hint of dawn. The trees vanished. The rock vanished. The sky itself vanished. There was only the screaming white wind, and the small warm chamber buried deep in the heart of the stone, and the 3 living things inside it. For 3 days and 3 nights, the storm buried the high country under snow deeper than a tall man stood. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Silas Hartley fought to keep the small warm world inside the stone from dying. It was the vent that tried to kill them, just as the old man had warned. Every few hours, the eastern vent threatened to freeze shut beneath the wind-packed ice that built and built across the high opening. And every time, Silas heard it before he saw it, heard the change in the draft, the low, steady song of the air narrowing into a thin and dangerous whistle that meant the ice was closing in somewhere above. He learned to sleep in pieces, minutes at a time, fully dressed, propped against the throat wall, one part of his mind always awake and listening to the breath of the mountain. When the whistle came, he would rise, wrap a scarf across his mouth, and climb out into the storm to clear the ice before the smoke could turn and come hunting for his son. The first time, the cold hit him like a fist. It drove the air clean out of his lungs and froze the breath in his beard before he had taken 3 steps. The wind shoved at his back, trying to send him sliding off the ridge into the black ravine below, where one bad step would be the last he ever took. He dropped to his knees beside the half-buried vent and clawed at the ice. He had the iron pry bar that first night. He drove it into the packed ice again and again, chipping, breaking, until the gap opened and the mountain pulled clean air through the shaft once more. And far below him, in the warm dark, He knew the smoke was climbing the way it should. Then he crawled back inside, half frozen, and held his coughing son, and waited for the next time. And the next time always came. The second night was worse. The wind had grown into something that no longer seemed like weather at all, but like a living thing that had set its will against the small, stubborn fire in the rock. The whole cave shook under it. Loose shale dust sifted down from cracks in the ceiling, drifting through the firelight like falling stars. Asa slept wrapped in every blanket they owned beside the heat-soaked bench, and Bracken pressed himself tight against the boy's outer side, the old dog's body a living wall between the child and the cold air that tried to creep down from the entrance, and Silas kept the fire small. That lesson was carved into his bones now, paid for on a single terrible night, with the smoke and the sound of his son fighting for air. Let the blaze stay low. Let the stone carry the weight. Ask the mountain gently, and trust it to give back what it had been given. He kept the fire small and patient and controlled, and he let the stone do the work, rotating warmed river stones near the sleeping shelf, sliding the kettles against the heat-soaked rock, while the storm screamed itself raw against the mountain outside. The water stayed unfrozen. The throat wall held. The gravel bed kept the floor dry beneath the snow that came in on his boots and his coat each time he climbed out into the dark. But the vent never stopped trying. On the third night, it nearly won. Silas had pushed himself past the edge of his own strength. He had not truly slept in 2 days. His hands were torn and swollen, the old wounds split open again and frozen and split again, and the warmth of the cave, that gentle, patient, life-giving warmth, had begun to do to him exactly what the old man had warned of. It lulled him. He sat against the throat wall, meaning only to close his eyes a moment, and the warmth wrapped around him, soft as a blanket, gentle as a hand, whispering that he could rest now, that he had earned it, that everything was fine. And he began to drift. It was the dog that saved them. A low, frantic growl cut through the fog in Silas's mind. Bracken was on his feet, ears flat, nose pointed at the eastern vent, and from his old throat came a sound Silas had never heard him make, a sound of warning, a sound of fear. Silas jerked awake, and he smelled it, smoke, thick and wrong, and heavy with wet ash. The draft had reversed completely. The vent had frozen shut at last, somewhere up in the screaming dark, and the smoke was rolling backward through the throat wall, pouring down into the chamber, toward the place where his son lay sleeping. Asa was already coughing. Silas was up and moving before he was fully awake, his heart slamming against his ribs. He grabbed for the pry bar. It was not there. In his exhaustion, somewhere in the long siege of the storm, he had set it down outside, and the wind had taken it, or the snow had swallowed it. It was gone. There was no time to find another. The smoke was thickening. The boy was coughing harder now. That deep, racking sound that Silas knew, that he would know in his nightmares until the day he died. The sound of a child's lungs fighting for clean air that was not there. He pulled the scarf across his mouth, and he climbed out into the storm with nothing but his 2 bare hands. The cold was beyond anything the nights before had been. The wind tore at him, blind and screaming, and the snow drove sideways so hard he could not see the vent he was crawling toward, could only feel for it through the wind-packed ice. He found it half buried, and he began to dig. He clawed at the frozen ice and shale with his bare hands, and the cold and the rough stone shredded the skin from his fingers almost at once, and he did not stop. He could not stop. Somewhere below him, in the warm dark he had built with such care and such love, his son could not breathe. The wind shoved against his back again and again, trying to send him over the edge into the ravine. His boots slid on the lure's snow. Once his whole body lurched toward the black drop, and only a wild grab at a jutting spur of rock saved him. He kept digging. His hands had gone past pain into a kind of distant numbness. He could see the blood, dark in the white, but he could no longer feel where his fingers ended and the ice began. The smoke pulsed weakly up through a narrowing gap, no wider than his fist. Not enough. Not nearly enough. "Come on," he gasped into the wind, the words torn from his mouth the moment he spoke them. "Come on. Breathe. Breathe. You stubborn old mountain. Let her breathe." And then, at last, the blockage cracked. It gave way all at once, a great chunk of ice breaking loose under his bleeding hands, and the mountain drew a long, sucking breath up through the open shaft. He heard it, even over the storm, that deep, clean drawing of air that meant the draft had turned right again. He half fell, half crawled back down into the cave. The smoke was already vanishing, drawn up and out as the mountain breathed clean once more. He stumbled to the bench and pulled his son up into his arms, and the boy coughed, and then, slowly, began to breathe. Just breathe. In and out. In and out. Silas sank to the floor with the boy held tight against his chest, his ruined hands shaking, his whole body shuddering with cold and exhaustion, and a terror so deep it had no bottom. And he held his son and rocked him and did not let go for a very long time, while outside the storm screamed on through the dark like something furious that the mountain had refused, one more time, to let inside. The storm finally loosened its grip near the dawn of the fourth day. Not all at once. The wind still moved across the high ridges in long, hollow, exhausted bursts, but the fury had gone out of it. The mountain no longer sounded angry. It sounded spent. Silas stepped out from the cave, carrying the iron mattock he had found again, half buried near the entrance, and he stopped, and he simply stared. The world had been remade in white. The drifts stood chest-deep across the lower slope, and far deeper where the wind had stacked them against the fence lines and the sheds. Whole stands of pine had vanished beneath smooth white mounds. The trail that had once led down toward the valley was nothing now but a faint, soft depression winding through an ocean of snow. It was beautiful. It was terrible. And it was utterly, perfectly silent. Silas looked down toward the distant valley, toward the place where the Shaw Ranch building should have been, half hidden now beneath the snow. And the thing he saw, or rather, the thing he did not see, troubled him at once. No smoke, no thread of it rising from the ranch house chimney, not even a thin one. He stood very still, looking at that absence, and a cold understanding began to settle into him that had nothing to do with the weather. He remembered from before the storm noticing that the Shaw woodpile had been running low. He remembered thinking that Harlan had expected the weather to pass quick, the way hard winters always had before, and had not laid in enough wood to outlast a siege like the one that had just passed. 3 days. 3 days of buried chimneys and screaming wind and killing cold. And no smoke, now, from the ranch below. Behind him, the blanket across the throat wall stirred, and Asa stepped out into the dazzling white. The boy looked down at the silent valley. He looked at the place where the smoke should have been. And then he looked up at his father, and he did not ask what Silas was thinking. He already knew. Bracken came and stood beside them, awake and watchful, his eyes fixed on the long white slope below. "If he's alive down there," Silas said, very quietly, almost to himself, "he won't have the strength left to dig out alone." He stood another long moment, listening to the weak wind crossing the snowfields. It was not forgiveness. He wanted to be honest with himself about that, even now. It was not some clean and easy reconciliation, the kind that lives in stories and not in the hearts of real and wounded men. It was something simpler and harder and truer than that. Asa would grow up someday to be the kind of man shaped by what he had watched his father do in the worst of times. And Silas would not, could not, let his son grow into a man who remembered that people had been left to die within reach of help. Not even those people. Not even the man who had cast them both up here to freeze. Without a word, Asa turned and went back into the cave. He came out a moment later, carrying the last dry pair of gloves they still had, and he held them up to his father. Silas looked down at his son, at the boy who had every reason in the world to want the man down in that valley to suffer, and who was, instead, handing over the last warm thing they owned, so that his father might go and save him. He took the gloves. "You stay here," he said. "Keep the fire small. Keep Bracken close. You know how to read her now, same as me." Asa nodded. "Bring 'em back, Pa," the boy said. "Even him." And Silas pulled on the dry gloves over his ruined hands, took up the iron mattock, and started down into the buried white. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the ranch. The snow rose past his waist where the wind had stacked the drifts, and in places past his chest, and more than once he sank in so deep he had to claw and fight his way back out before he could go on. He used the iron bar ahead of every step, probing through the hidden crust for the buried ice and debris underneath, trusting his weight forward only when the bar found solid ground. By the time the ranch house finally emerged through the blowing white, he already knew, in his gut, that he had not come too soon. No smoke rose from the chimney, not even a thin and dying wisp. The drift against the front of the house reached halfway up the windows. Silas hacked through the packed snow with the mattock and forced the door inward against a ridge of ice that had built along the threshold. It gave at last and swung in, and the cold rolled out to meet him, the cold of a house that had lost its fight. Inside, the air sat barely warmer than the storm outside. Frost had spread across the interior walls in the corners. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a few weak coals, glowing beneath a deep gray bed of ash, giving off no real heat at all. And he saw what they had been doing to stay alive. A dining chair had been chopped apart for fuel, the pieces fed one by one into the dying fire, Part of a cabinet lay broken beside the hearth. They had been burning their own home, stick by stick, in a losing race against the cold. Della Shaw sat wrapped in every blanket the house held, close by the failing fire, trembling so hard the tin cup in her two hands rattled without pause. And Harlan looked worse. The storm had hollowed the man out. His face had gone gray and gaunt in 3 short days. Frost clung to his beard where his own breath had frozen against it in the long, cold night. He sat slumped near the hearth, and when the door opened and the gray light fell across him, he lifted his head slow, like it cost him everything he had left. For several long seconds, no one in that frozen room spoke a word. Then Harlan's eyes moved over the man standing in his doorway, over the dry wool coat on Silas's shoulders, over the clear, alive light in his eyes, over the strength that was still in him, the strength of a man who had not spent 3 days losing a war against the cold. And Harlan Shaw understood. "The cave held," he said. His voice was a cracked and broken thing, barely more than a whisper. Silas nodded once. Della lowered her face into her 2 trembling hands, and her shoulders shook. And whether it was from the cold, or from something else entirely, no one could have said. Harlan stared into the dead gray ash of his own hearth for a long moment. Then, slowly, with a terrible effort, he pushed himself upright against the wall. "I ain't taking charity," he rasped. "Not from you. The old pride, the old iron. Even here, even now." Silas looked at him across that freezing room. He was not angry. He was not triumphant. He was only tired and cold and certain. "This isn't charity," he said quietly, "and it isn't about you and me. That's done. That's old." He took a step into the room. "Lenora wouldn't forgive either one of us," he said, "if that boy up there had to bury more family after this winter. She loved you, Harlan. God knows why, the way you've been. But she did. And I won't let her sister's husband freeze in his own house while I've got a warm place a 2-hour walk away." The room went silent, but for the wind pressing soft against the outer walls. Harlan stared at him. Something was breaking in the man's face. Something that had been frozen solid for a very long time, longer even than this winter, was finally beginning to give. And then Della spoke, for the first time, her voice small and broken. "The boots," she whispered. Did the boy get the boots?" Silas looked at her and understood, all at once, the full shape of what this woman had been carrying. "He did," Silas said gently. "They fit him fine. He says to thank you." Della Shaw began to weep in earnest then, the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone setting down a weight they have carried far too long and far too alone. And Harlan, watching his wife, reached at last for his coat where it hung beside the door. The climb back up the mountain nearly broke what little strength the Shaws had left. The snow reached almost to their shoulders in the worst places where the wind had buried the upper trail. Silas went ahead with the mattock, breaking the path. Behind him came Harlan, and then Della. And Silas had to stop again and again to haul them forward through the drifts. The 3 of them roped together against the white. Bracken came down to meet them part way, the old dog moving through the snow like he knew where the solid ground lay hidden beneath it, leading them up, step by careful step. By the time they reached the mouth of the cave, Della could barely lift her feet. And then Silas pulled aside the timber barrier and the canvas behind it, and the warm air touched their faces. Not a blazing heat, not the suffocating blast of an overstoked stove. Something steadier than that, something gentler, a dry, stable, living warmth that did not fight the winter so much as quietly, patiently refused to surrender to it. Della made a small sound in her throat, a sound that was half a sob and half something with no name at all. Harlan stopped just inside the throat wall. For several seconds, he said nothing. He could not. He looked at the water buckets near the rear of the chamber, sitting clear and unfrozen. He looked at the damp gloves drying on the line stretched between the iron spikes. He looked at Asa's wool coat steaming faintly beside the wall, where the river stones still held their warmth from the night before. He looked at the old dog crossing the floor to lie back down beside the boy, easy and unhurried, not trembling, not cold. He looked at all of it, the drainage trench, the controlled air, the dry blankets, the low ceiling that held the warmth close above the sleeping shelf, the small, patient fire giving up far less heat than the great stone walls around it gave back. And Harlan Shaw finally, fully understood what the man he had cast out had actually built inside the mountain. Not a hiding place, not a desperate hole to crawl into and die. A system, a thing made carefully enough, lovingly enough, to carry a child through the worst winter that country had ever known. Better than his own fine ranch house in the valley ever could. Slowly, the older man crossed the chamber. He came to the long stone bench, and he reached out one shaking, frost-bitten hand, and he rested it against the dark rock. It was warm, still warm, even now, even after the longest, cruelest night of all their lives. The warmth of a fire that had burned down hours before, held faithful in the stone, waiting. And something in Harlan Shaw broke open at last. The iron he had wrapped around his grief, the hatred he had built plank by plank since the day his sister died in a cold timber cabin, the pride that had let him drive a man and a child up a mountain to die. All of it, all at once, gave way. He bowed his head over that warm stone, this hard and broken man, and his shoulders began to shake. "I sent you up here to die," he said. The words came out cracked and ruined. "I sent a child up here to die, and you came down through that storm to save the men who did it." Silas said nothing. He only laid a bowl of warm broth on the bench beside the weeping man and added one small piece of cedar to the patient fire. No wasted fuel, no roaring flames, just enough. Always, now, just enough. And in the warm heart of the mountain that the whole valley had laughed at, while the spent storm sighed its last out over the white and silent country, 4 people and an old brown dog sat together in the glow of a fire that had learned, at long last, how to hold its warmth and how to give it back. The road crews did not break the lower trails open for the better part of 2 weeks after this great storm finally passed. But the story moved faster than any road crew ever could. It traveled the way the truest stories always travel in a small and isolated place. From one warm kitchen to the next, in low voices over cups of coffee, told and retold until everyone in the valley had heard some version of it. How the cold had very nearly taken the Shaws in their own fine ranch house. How the woodpile had run low, and the fire had failed. And how Harlan Shaw himself had been reduced to chopping up his own furniture, stick by stick, just to keep a few weak coals alive. How a man the whole valley had turned its back on had come walking down out of the high country, through drifts that reached his chest, on hands torn open and bleeding, to dig them out. And how the boy who was supposed to have frozen to death in a hole in the rock before the first heavy snow even fell. That boy had come through the worst winter the country had ever known, warmer and healthier and stronger than half the children sleeping in the timber houses down in the valley below, slowly. The way folks spoke of Silas Hartley began to change. The men who gathered around the stove in the general store no longer said his name with that easy amusement, or with the careful, sliding contempt that had followed him for so long like a shadow he could not shake. They said it quietly now, the way people speak of a thing they once judged far too quickly, and are only now, with no small amount of shame, beginning to understand. The first to climb the ridge was Wade Reed. The young ranch hand came up the trail with a load of split cedar lashed to a hand sled, hauling it through the softening snow, and he stopped a few feet shy of the throat wall, and there he hesitated. He did not seem to know whether he still had any right to be standing there at all. He had turned his back, after all. He had stood inside that warm chamber months before, and pressed his own bare hand to the impossible warmth of the stone, and felt the wonder of it run all the way up his arm. And then he had let the fear of losing the Shaw's favor send him walking back down the mountain, and he had not returned. Not when the prices climbed, not when the whispers hardened. Not even when the great storm came howling down off the divide. Now he stood in the snow, the shame written plain across his young face, and he opened his mouth to say something, some apology, some clumsy explanation for the weeks of silence. Silas did not let him struggle through it. He simply stepped to one side and held the canvas open, and let the young man come in out of the cold. No speech, no accounting of old wrongs, no making the boy crawl through his guilt to earn a place by the fire. Just the open door, and the warmth waiting beyond it. And something in Wade Reed's chest came loose that had been clenched tight with shame for weeks. He carried his cedar inside and stacked it neat beside the bench without being asked, and then he stayed a good long while. He asked again about the airflow and the gravel bed and the careful angle of the shale above the fire. But he asked differently this time, the way a young man asks when he has decided, somewhere deep down, that he is going to learn a thing properly and stick with it, no matter what it costs him in the eyes of the men who hold the purse strings. When he left that evening, he turned back at the mouth of the cave. "I should have come back," he said. "After the first time, I knew it was real. I felt it. And I let 'em talk me out of what I knew with my own two hands." He swallowed. "I won't do that again. Not ever." Silas looked at the young man a long moment. "A man who learns that lesson young," he said quietly, "is luckier than most. Some never learn it at all." And Wade Reed went down the mountain a little taller than he had come up it. After Wade, The others came in twos and threes, the way a thaw always comes, not all at once. A drop here, a trickle there. Pastor Brandt came openly now, in the full light of day, with flour and dried beans and good lamp oil roped to the back of a mule. He did not offer it as charity. He had learned, watching a man bleed in the dark outside the forge, that this was not a man who could take charity and keep his soul whole. So he sat by the fire a while instead, and the thing he set down was not the supplies. "I watched you that night," the pastor admitted at last, "outside the forge, bleeding and not stopping, and I did nothing." He stared into the flames. "I told myself it was respect. I wonder now if it wasn't just the easier thing, to dress my doing nothing up as a virtue." "You're here now," Silas said. "Most folks never get around to here at all." The pastor had climbed the mountain to give a gift. He went back down the one who'd received it. A few days later, 2 ranch hands hauled repaired iron brackets up the long trail, having heard how close the vent had come to freezing shut on the worst night of all. They made no speeches. They knelt and fitted the iron with sure, quiet hands, and tested the draft, and when it ran clean and strong, they let out a slow breath and nodded once at the work. Then they shouldered their empty packs and started down. The long climb up had been the apology. The careful work had been the rest of it. Nothing else needed saying, and so nothing else was said. And then, near the end of the second week, even Mabel Cruz climbed the ridge, the widow who had raised his prices and hidden his oil and spoken her cruelty loud enough for a whole store full of people to hear and remember. She made that long, hard climb up to the cave on her own 2 aging legs, and she stepped inside, and for a while she said almost nothing at all. Most people didn't. Not once they were standing inside that warm chamber, feeling the impossible truth of it rise up through their feet and settle into their cold hands. She looked at the dry, steady warmth moving through the stone, at the snowmelt water sitting clear and unfrozen by the bench in the dead heart of winter, at the gloves drying overhead on the line, and whatever hard and certain thing she had carried up that trail to say, it simply left her, there in the warmth, and she did not pick it back up again. She set down a small sack by the entrance. Salt, the good kind, more than she had ever once sold him. And on her way back out into the snow, she paused and she turned, and she looked at the man she had judged so harshly for so long. "My late husband," she said, and her voice was rough with something she rarely let show. "He always told me a person's worth isn't in what they've got. It's in what they do with the little they've been handed." She pressed her thin lips together. "I knew that once, and I forgot it. These last long months, I forgot it clean. And I'm ashamed of the woman I let myself become." Silas did not gloat. There was nothing in him that wanted to. "Winter makes people afraid," he said gently, the same words he had once spoken to his son. "It made me hard, too, in my way. Shut me up tight against folks. We all of us froze a little this past year." Mabel Cruz looked at him with old, wet eyes. "And you," she said, "you're the only one who figured out how to thaw." Then she went out, an old woman picking her way carefully down a path that a younger man's bleeding hands had carved through the deepest of the drifts. The cave itself did most of the talking after that. There was no argument left to make, no mockery in the world that could stand up against the plain, undeniable fact of three people who should by every right have been dead, and who were instead alive and warm and fed. Della Shaw became the one who came most often. Once the trails were broken, she climbed the ridge 2 and 3 times a week, and she did not come empty-handed, and after a while she did not come out of guilt anymore either. She came because of the boy. She had never had children of her own. It was the great quiet grief of her life, the one she had carried folded away where no one could see it. And in the long, slow, healing weeks of that spring, Asa Hartley slipped without either of them quite meaning it into the empty place in her heart where children should have been. And he filled it. She mended his clothes, sitting by the fire with her needle while he read aloud, stumbling over the hard words. She taught him the small songs she remembered from her own girlhood, songs about rivers and birds and far-off green places. She brought him books with soft, worn covers, and once a small carved horse that had belonged to a brother of hers, lost long ago. And the boy, who had lost his own mother to the cold and the thin walls, and the fire that could not save her, found in this quiet, gentle, grieving woman something he had been missing without ever quite knowing its name. Not a mother. No one could ever be that. And neither of them ever pretended otherwise. But something near to it. A warmth in the shape of a woman who looked at him with love and asked for nothing back. One evening, Silas came in from splitting wood to find the two of them sitting close by the fire, the woman's arm around the boy's thin shoulders, the boy's head leaning into her side, both of them watching the flames in a comfortable, easy silence. And Della was singing, very softly, one of those old girlhood songs. Silas stood at the throat wall a moment, unseen, and he felt something in his chest that he had no good word for, because a child needs more than one person to love him. A child needs a whole ring of warmth around him, the way a fire needs a whole ring of stone to hold its heat through the long, cold night. And his son, who had been so terribly alone, so cold in every way that truly mattered. His son was slowly, surely, being wrapped in that warmth again. The valley was knitting itself back together, one careful stitch at a time, and the boy at the center of it was the thread. Harlan Shaw was the slowest of them all to find his way. The hardest things take the longest to thaw. And there had been more frozen up inside that man than in any drift the storm had left stacked against the fence lines. But he came. At first he came in silence, climbing the ridge to sit a while by the fire and say almost nothing at all, the way a man visits a place he is not yet sure he has any right to be. He would watch the boy. He would rest his hand, when he thought no one was looking, against the warm stone of the bench. And then he would rise and nod once and go back down the mountain into the dusk. Then came the afternoon that changed him. Several men had gathered outside the cave to unload a sled of wood, and in front of all of them, Harlan Shaw did a thing that cost him more than any of them could ever know. He took off his gloves, slow, and he spoke, loud enough for every man there to hear. Silas Hartley kept us alive, he said. In the very place this whole valley laughed at, the place I gave him to die in. He let that hang in the cold air. I was wrong about the cave. His jaw worked, fighting the words out one at a time. And I was wrong about the man. I judged him for being poor. I judged him for burying my sister. When the hard truth is, I couldn't have kept her alive any better than he could have. And I knew it. And I hated him for it, because hating him was easier than hating the winter. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence carried far too much truth for that. I made that man carry my grief, Harlan went on, his voice cracking now, stacked right on top of his own. All this long, bitter year. I drove him and a little boy up a mountain to freeze. And he paid me back for it by walking down through the worst storm any of us ever saw, to dig my worthless hide out of a fire I'd let die. He stopped. He looked at his own rough hands, ungloved in the cold. A man can be wrong, he said, quieter. Lord knows I've been wrong about near everything that ever mattered in my life. But I've learned this much, this past winter. A man can also stop being wrong, if he's got the spine to say it out loud, in front of God and everybody. He pulled his gloves back on, and he turned and went back to unloading the wood, and not one man there ever spoke of it again, because nothing more needed to be said. But that night, after the others had gone, Harlan stayed. The two men sat by the fire a long while in silence, the boy asleep on the shelf above them, the old dog stretched between them in the warmth. "She'd be glad," Harlan said at last, staring into the coals. "Lenora. She'd be glad we finally quit being fools, the both of us." "She would," Silas agreed. "She always said I was too hard." A rough, broken sound that might once have been a laugh. "Said I'd freeze my own heart solid one day if I wasn't careful. Said it'd take something powerful to thaw me back out." He looked around the warm chamber, at the stone that held its heat through the longest of nights. "Reckon it took a whole mountain," he said. And Silas, beside him in the firelight, finally let himself smile. "It took more than that," he said softly. "It took losing nearly everything. And then finding out, almost too late, what was worth saving." Harlan was quiet a long moment. Then he reached out, this hard and broken and slowly mending man, and he gripped Silas Hartley's shoulder once, firm and brief. It was not an apology. Harlan had spent the only one he had out loud already, in front of God and every man at the woodpile. This was the other kind, the kind that lives in a hand, laid in warmth upon a shoulder, and asks for nothing back. One day, near the deepening of the spring, the old trapper came down off his lonely ridge. Amos Thorne had not visited the cave since the gray afternoon he stood outside its wall and gave away the very worst grief of his long life, so that another man's son might have the chance to live. He stood at the entrance now, and Silas brought him in, and the old man looked around the warm chamber with those ancient, weathered, all-seeing eyes. He saw the boy, healthy and whole, teaching the little carved horse to gallop across the warm stone bench. He saw the dog, asleep and content in the heat. He saw the gray sweater, still hanging faithful on its peg. And he saw, most of all, the thing he had come down the mountain to see. that the soft, warm, creeping death he had warned about, the death that had taken his own grandson from him so many long years ago, in a shelter built too tight and loved too much, that death had been faced down on the worst night of all, and it had been beaten. The boy had lived. This time, the boy had lived. Amos did not say much. He never did. But he stayed a long while by that fire, and there was a stillness in him that Silas had never seen before. The deep stillness of a man finally setting down a weight he had carried, alone, up and down a cold mountain for more years than he could bear to count. Some part of the old man's grief had found, at long last, a place to rest. Not in forgetting. A man does not forget a boy he was meant to keep, but in knowing this, that the hard and terrible knowledge his loss had bought, knowledge no man should ever have to pay such a price to learn, had, at the very last, kept another child alive through the cruelest winter of all. His grandson's death had taught a stranger how to save a son. And as he sat there, quiet, in the warmth of that found and unlikely family, the old man seemed to feel, perhaps for the first time, that this was a thing a grief might finally be able to rest upon. When he rose to go, he paused at the boy's side and rested one gnarled old hand on the small head. "You listen to your pa," Amos said gruffly. "And you listen to the mountain. They'll both teach you true, if you've got the ears for it." Then he went back up his lonely ridge, but he came down more often after that, to sit by the fire, to watch the boy grow, to teach him, now and again, some small old secret of the high country that no one else alive still knew. To be in the warmth of that strange and gentle family, a little less alone than he had been for a very long time. There was a place, on a high slope facing the morning sun, where Silas Hartley went alone one quiet day, when the spring had softened the last of the snow. It was where Lenora lay. He had not been able to give her a fine resting place, only a simple marker set on a windswept rise where the first warm light of each new day touched the stone before it reached anywhere else in all that country. He sat down beside it in the new grass, and for a long while he did not say anything at all. He had come to this place many times over the long, hard year, and every single time before he had come carrying the same crushing weight, the guilt, the memory of a cold cabin and a fire that had burned bright and useless while she lay shivering beneath two quilts. The words she had spoken, soft as an apology, near the very end. "This house stays cold from the floor upward." Those words had haunted every cold night of his life since. But today, he did not feel the weight. Today, sitting in the warm spring grass beside the woman he had loved and lost, he felt something he had not let himself feel in longer than he could remember. Peace. "I couldn't keep you warm," he said at last, softly, to the stone and the grass and the gentle morning light. "I tried. God knows I tried. But the walls were thin, and I didn't know then what I know now, and I couldn't keep the cold out, and it took you right out of my arms, and there wasn't a thing I could do." The wind moved soft across the high slope. "I carried that every night," he went on. "The thought that if I'd just been a better man, a smarter man, a man worth more than the little he had, that you'd still be here, laughing at the hard things, the way only you could ever do." He drew a long breath. "I believed a man who couldn't keep his own wife warm had no business hoping for anything good. Not ever again. I climbed up that mountain half believing I deserved to freeze on it." He looked out over the valley, greening now in the spring, the snow drawing back up the slopes like a tide going out. "But I kept him warm, Lenora," he said. And now, at last, something moved in his voice. Not grief. Something cleaner than grief. "I kept Asa warm, all through the very worst of it. He never coughed once, the way you did. He never shivered in the dark. I learned how. I finally learned how." His hand came to rest on the warm stone of her marker, sun-heated, the way the stone of the bench was always warm. "Too late for you," he whispered, "but not too late for him. And maybe that's the thing. Maybe a man doesn't get to fix what's broken. Maybe all he gets to do is learn from it, and use what he learns, and keep the next one warm." He sat with that a long while. "You'd be so proud of him," he said. "He's got your laugh, and he's getting your way of making the big, hard things seem small. And he's got a whole valley full of people looking out for him now. Even your brother, Lord Lenora. Especially your brother." A real smile touched his face then. Small and true. You'd hardly know Harlan. The cold went clean out of him, same as it went out of the mountain the morning the storm finally broke. Turns out the hardest stone in the whole country just needed the right kind of warmth to thaw. He sat until the sun had climbed well up into the wide blue sky, and when he finally rose to go back down to the cave, to his son and his old dog, and the strange new family that the worst winter of his life had somehow, impossibly, given him, he left the grief there on the high slope, not forgotten, it would never be forgotten, but laid down, at last, set gently in the warm spring grass, in the morning light, in the one place where the sun always reached first, where it could finally rest. And he walked back down the mountain with his hands empty, and his heart, for the first time in longer than he could remember, light. The years that followed were good ones. The cave remained. At first it was home to only a man and his son, and an old brown dog who lived a great many more good years than anyone had expected, sleeping warm beside the bench until the very end of his days. But word of the warm place spread, the way word of any good and useful thing will always spread through a hard country. Travelers caught out by sudden storms on the high divide learned that there was a warm stone shelter on the eastern ridge, a place where a man would never, not for any reason, turn a freezing soul away from his door. There came a night, years on, when a young freighter lost his team in a whiteout up on the high pass. He stumbled half frozen through the dark, certain he was going to die out there in the screaming white, the way men did in that country. And then he saw it. A faint and steady glow, deep in the rock of the eastern ridge. He fell through the throat wall, more dead than alive. And 2 days later, when the storm had blown itself out, he walked back down the mountain on his own 2 feet, warm and fed and alive, carrying a story he would tell for the rest of his long life. The story of the warm place in the mountain, and the quiet family who lived there, and asked nothing of him but that he pass the kindness on. The valley stopped calling it the cave that a man had been sent to die in. They called it the warm place now, and they spoke of it with something close to pride, as though the whole valley had built it together, and not one stubborn, grieving man with bleeding hands and a promise he refused to break. Asa grew tall and quiet and sure. He grew into a young man with his father's careful hands and his mother's easy laugh, and a gift for reading the mountain that some old-timers swore was finer than Amos Thorne's had ever been. He learned how stone holds warmth, and how the damp steals it away, and how the mountain breathes if a man only has the patience to let it. And he learned something else too, something his father never once had to teach him in words, because the boy had watched it lived out in front of him every single day of that long, healing year. He learned that a person's true worth is never in what they have been handed. It is in what they choose to do with it. He learned that a cave the whole world calls worthless might only be waiting, patient as stone, for the right pair of hands to finally understand it. And he learned that a man the whole world has written off as a failure might be carrying all along, quietly, beneath the contempt and the cold, the very thing that will one day keep them all alive. On a warm evening, many years on, Silas Hartley sat outside the mouth of the cave. He was an old man now. His hands, those hands that had bled into the ice to keep his son breathing, were at last allowed to rest. His grown son sat beside him, and down inside, in the warm glow of the fire, Della Shaw, gray-haired and gentle now, was teaching a small child a song, one of those old girlhood songs about rivers and birds and far-off green places. Harlan dozed in a chair against the wall, gray-headed and soft, the last of the iron gone out of him for good and all, years ago. The gray sweater still hung on its peg. No one had ever taken it down. It had simply become part of the place, part of the warmth, a quiet, patient presence, watching over them all through the years. Silas looked at it a long moment in the failing light, and then he looked at the family the cold had so very nearly destroyed, and somehow, in the end, had only gathered closer together. And he's understood, at last, the strangest and the kindest truth of his whole long and difficult life. The winter had not come to take everything from him. He had believed that once. On the night they cast him out. On the night the smoke nearly took his son. He had believed the cold was nothing but a thief, come to strip him of the last few things he had left to lose. But he understood now that he had been wrong. The winter had come to teach him how to hold what truly mattered close against his chest, and how, in the holding of it, to give its warmth away to others who were cold. The fire held. The stone stayed warm. And the man who had once believed himself good for nothing in this world but failure and grief sat in the heart of the mountain that had saved them all, surrounded by the warmth he had learned, too late for one beloved soul, and just in time for all the rest. How to keep. His son's shoulder rested against his own. The voices of his family drifted out to him, soft and easy, from the glowing dark within. And somewhere up on a high slope, facing the morning sun, the grief he had finally laid down slept easy in the warm grass. It was enough. After everything, after all of it, it was more than enough.